Hey everyone, Chris here. Before we get into the episode, I just wanted to give you a little context about what this week is. When I started this podcast about a year ago, my original intention was that it was going to be interviews with people whose music in the Christian music scene had influenced me over the years. That's how Joe and I actually got started talking, was I interviewed him about a year ago, and you can go back and listen to it. It's one of my favorite episodes we've done. And in that time, we've kind of moved away from that premise, but we have had interviews occasionally. Reese Roper, Steve Taylor, those have been great. They were people who were on my list from the start. But at the very top of the list of people I always wanted to talk to for this podcast was Derek Webb. I've talked about him on the podcast before. His music was influential for me. As a college kid, Caedmon's Call was basically top of my list. It got me through my college years. It got me through my single years. His solo career, beginning with 2003's She Must and Shall Go Free, has been just very influential with me. He's always had this knack for writing songs that hit right where I'm at in a particular moment. And so he's been a very influential songwriter for me. I've had the privilege of seeing him in concert a few times, and he's always put on a wonderful show. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go to one of his house shows where he actually plays in people's living rooms, and he played his new album, Fingers Crossed, which is a different direction than he's gone before. And content-wise, it talks about some heavy stuff and some changes in his life. And I really wanted to talk to him about that. And so at the house show, I kind of brought up briefly that I would love to have him on the podcast. And he agreed. And the past few weeks, we've been kind of trying to set up a time, and that happened very recently. We were able to talk via Skype for about an hour. And so this week's episode is that conversation between myself and Derek Webb. As I tell him at the end of the interview, this is a bucket list get for me. I mean, he is... I can't stress enough how much his music has meant to me. And that's been kind of a struggle as he's gone a new direction and wrestled with some things where I no longer find myself always identifying with his songs. And so I usually don't do this. I usually want to let the episodes stand for themselves. But I did write a blog post this week, which you can read at Pathos, and I'll link to in the show notes. And I might encourage you to go back and read that before you listen to this episode, because I feel like it sets up what Derek and I talk about and the difficulty I kind of had adjusting to Fingers Crossed, which I've come to love and really cherish as one of his best albums. So I would encourage you to go back and read that. If you don't, you can still enjoy the interview. And if you're a fan of Derek and you know his story, please jump right in. I think it was a great interview. I am very grateful for him taking the time to talk with me. I would love to have him back on again when his new album comes out. And I would love to do more of these interviews. So I'm starting to think of a way to do that, to talk about some issues in Christian culture and art in a way that talks about where we're going moving forward. So I'm formulating something that I hope to have up by the fall. So stay tuned on that. I really want to integrate more interviews into this podcast, or maybe another forum. So we'll see what happens. But for now, I hope you enjoy this interview with Derek Webb. And we will be back with Joe next week. We have a conversation queued up that turned out really well that I'm excited for you all to hear. So keep listening, and stay tuned. We'll be having more interviews in the future. Derek, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate it. I know
it's
you're busy.
A pleasure.
So,
no, not at all.
You are out in Nashville right now, right? Is that where
Nashville,
you live?
Tennessee. Yeah, yeah. I've been here for almost 20 years, I think.
Nice. How is the weather down there today?
It sucks, actually. It's usually pretty beautiful, but we've had like severe rain for a couple of days. I mean, I can't believe I'm complaining about this. It's fine. It's great. But no, it's been some pretty treacherous rain for a couple of days, but otherwise okay.
Yeah, we've been having nice weather in Detroit for a while. It was sunny,
Right.
75, and now it's shooting up to like 100 and muggy all weekend.
Oh, it's definitely been insanely hot. So
it's
at least
bad.
we're getting a break. Yeah.
Yeah, I was hoping to take the kids out to a campground this weekend, visit my parents, and I think it's going to be an indoors watch movies type of weekend.
Oh, it's the best kind, though.
Avoid heat stroke. So well, again, I want to thank you for doing this, because I've been a fan for a very long time.
Oh, man.
And I kind of want to jump off with that, because you currently host a podcast, Airing of Grief.
Yeah.
And from listening to that and from talking to many of my friends, you've really been the soundtrack to many people's journey in their adulthood. And I feel I'm no different. I mean, when I was single, I was playing Table for Two on a loop. And when I was in my Cage Stage phase, She Must and Shall Go Free was like that was like the anthem for angry Reformed guys.
Right.
So, and then as I began to kind of wrestle with Christian culture and evangelicalism, and my politics started to shift, every album you did seemed to hit that note that I was at in that moment. And I know I'm not the first. I'm not the first to say that. So when you hear someone says that, especially knowing your trajectory and your current wrestling with what you believe and how that's all changed, and having an album where I think the message of that would be, you don't want to be where I'm at right now. How does that affect you when you hear people say that?
Well, I mean, obviously, as a writer, and as somebody who's been in this job for a long time, I'm mostly just so grateful. I mean, I'm so grateful that people, because there's so much, there are so many options when you have moments that you wish music to accompany you in. There are just so many options, and there's so much music, and there's so much, and so to be, found by anybody, let alone to be found by somebody at a moment when you might happen to be in a resonant place in your stories to where you could be kind of articulating your own story in a way that provides some language or explanation for what they're feeling in theirs. It's just special. It's like, it's rare. And so when it happens and you hear about it, like by the time that Plinko ball has to hit every peg just right to fall all the way to the bottom to where you're hearing about that having happened, it feels significant to me. And so obviously I'm super grateful. I mean, I'm depending on the particular season, and this most recent one might have been a little bit of one, but it is a little bit. I do feel as though sometimes I have to. I want to apologize to people when they tell me how much they relate, like to the most recent record and stuff, or something, or I can at least say, "Wow, I'm kind of sorry to hear that," or something. But and that's not the whole truth. But yeah, I mean, I'm nothing but grateful, because the act of songwriting and the years that I've spent writing and releasing music, you realize that you only spend, I, as the writer of it, the maker of it, only spend a pretty small amount of time really with the songs. Mm-hmm. Or I should say the most meaningful time I spend is when I'm making them, when I'm writing them, when I'm going through the experience that is lighting the fuse on or giving birth to them. That's when I'm spending the real time in those moments. And then once those moments pass and the songs are written and the document is made of the moment that I was in, then I still spend time with the songs, but it's different. Like when I'm out on the road and I play them, and that's kind of more the execution phase. But that's more kind of like going through, a scrapbook with somebody. I'm not really reliving it.
Right.
I'm just sharing my memory of it. And so I feel like I probably spend less time with the songs, than most people do. And so that said, like when a song, a particular song or a particular record seems to have some resonance and people comment to you about how much it's meant to them, or that if there's more than a handful of people who feel really connected to it, or were helped by it, or maybe it helped provide language for them for a season they were going through to help explain the feelings they were having and didn't have words for, or just made them feel less alone in the going through it because they thought they were the only one, and things like that. Like, that's the best thing that can happen, because the meaning for me personally is behind me somewhere.
Right.
And that experience, that significant experience I'm going to have with the songs, I had with them. And so now they're kind of everyone else's. And so you love hearing that. I mean, I of course I do. Yeah.
Yeah, there is an interesting thing when you started, when the content of a lot of your songs started to shift. And I remember I was wrestling with that. Like, what do I do with this artist who I've looked at in one context, and
Sure.
now they're taking a journey that I'm at that time not taking? What do I do with the music? And someone brought up to me, the songs are still the songs. They're still there, and
That's right.
And they still mean what they meant to you at that time and what they mean to you now.
Yeah.
And that helped me through a lot of it, knowing that, hey, in my angrier days, when if anything diverted from, Christian culture or anything like
Sure.
that, I could still hold on to those songs.
Yeah.
But I do wonder, because you had to know when you're writing Fingers Crossed that there are people who are not going to go on this journey with you. And
Sure.
you wrote a song at the very beginning basically giving them permission to stop listening.
Right.
And you've talked a lot before in concert that you have a tendency to kind of sabotage yourself career-wise. So
Right.
I'm wondering...
Or I'm willing to, anyway, yeah.
Yeah, and I am wondering, as someone who does write music for a living, who has to maintain a relationship with an audience, and for lack of a better word, and it's the crassest word, but faith has kind of been tied into your brand for a long time.
Sure.
As you're writing this music, how terrified were you that, hey, I might be calling Enterprise Rent-A-Car for a job in a few weeks, or I might lose my audience by being honest?
Right. Well, I wasn't nervous about it.
Okay.
It's actually just not even a thing that crosses my mind, and because I have found that being preoccupied with the expectations of your audience is a thing that ruins art, and that is a thing I learned a long time ago. So because even though Fingers Crossed might have been for some people too sharp of a pivot to follow me around, and I 100% not only understand, but as you said, anticipated it, and I'm okay with that, 100% okay with it. And no one has to explain to me why they might not, that they don't like the new record, or that they're not cool with it, or that that's not where they are. Oh my God, I totally understand, and I think, I've always been very comfortable with the idea that my music is not for everybody, and not only that, it's not for most people. Like, the music I make is, in fact, it's not even that, it's hardly for anybody. And so I'm just so grateful for the people who it is for, hearing about it, appreciating it, being comforted by it, challenged by it, whatever it is they need out of it. But, I've had a lot of practice over the years putting out records that I knew for sure beforehand people were not going to like. Or that there would be a huge segment of my current audience that I was going to lose over it, and I would have to gain a portion of that segment back out of a new audience. And that's kind of always been my thing. I mean, like, I've always kind of said that I kind of turn over or churn about a quarter or a third of my audience kind of annually. And that's fine with me. I mean, I don't want a bigger career. I don't want more fans. I just would love to stay at generally the spot where I am, so I can continue to make an honest blue collar living out of it. But I'm not like swinging for the back fence here. Like, I'm not, and that's not the kind of music I make. Those are not my expectations. And I know my music is not for everybody and hardly for anybody. So that said, I've just had a lot of practice. So I've always, this has been, the feeling I had putting out Fingers Crossed was not fundamentally different than the feeling I had putting out Stockholm Syndrome,
Okay.
or putting out Mockingbird, or even putting out She Must Shall Go Free. I mean, which I knew was going to was going to be a disruption to Caedmon's fans at that time. So, like, I've always just accepted that as part of the way I do the job. I've always looked for the thing that seems to be worth writing about that no one seems to be writing about, and that's where I kind of head. That's the way I'm wired. That's my instincts. And so, but the point is, I don't get preoccupied about it because I know for sure that great art does not have a chance of getting made if the artist is preoccupied with everyone's response about it and lets their fear about that inform the way that they are writing, what they're writing, how they're recording it. Because then you just never even have a chance for the honest thoughts to be heard. If you're already anticipating all the response and you're basically making the thing, you're diluting it in the actual process of creating it, which I'm sure, you know, is an irresistible temptation for most artists. But I've just had this really peculiar career where I, early on, started to feel like I've had this relationship with the people who've listened to my music that if I don't push hard enough, sometimes people have the kind of disappointment that other artists' fans would have if they pushed too hard.
Yeah, I think you would probably lose even more fans if you did a Chris Tomlin album.
If I just made some benign pop record about kind of nothing, I think most of my people would kind of, I think I'd lose a lot of people because I think they'd just be like, wow, well, that like, there's nothing wrong with that kind of music, but that's not why they listen to me. And so they're like, if this is what we want, like, we've already got this covered. Like, we know where we go to find this, but we come to you for something different. And why aren't you doing it? And why are you chickening out? And so it's like, so I think that since that's kind of been the expectation, I'm just kind of free of having to be preoccupied about it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And I think you're right. You've kind of, for better or worse, built a career on being a provocateur in many ways.
Which I haven't meant to do. It just keeps happening.
Well, I think if you're being honest, that's what happens sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, you used whore on your first album, which I worked at Family Christian stores. They frown on that. But
it's a lot of retail didn't carry that record.
Yeah. But I'll be honest, even though that's kind of what I've expected from you and what I like about your writing, I had a hard time with this album at first.
Of course, sure.
I first stopped listening after Stop Listening the first time I listened to it because and I realized it wasn't even so much because of anything you were saying about yourself, but you have that verse where you're writing about people responding to you, and I could hear my voice in that.
Right.
And you know, I had to go back and ask what are my views on this, and I realized this album requires something of its audience. I mean, especially if you're coming from a different viewpoint than you. Like if I'm coming at it from a, you know, where my faith is still at a point where I'm still probably comfortably orthodox in many ways.
Sure. And that's fine.
And I had to ask, you know, this isn't an album where you're going to rile me up and get me angry and, you know, channel my anger at something like you might have done in the past. You're asking for empathy. You're asking for an ear. And I think a lot of people, we don't want to have to work with our art. We want to be able to just absorb it all.
Consume it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's kind of like, I wrote film criticism for 13 years. And I would always have, you know, Tree of Life. You gotta go see Tree of Life. It's gonna change your life. And people walk out, they're like, that made me think too much. I don't like that.
Right. And that's kind of what I mean is, like, not only do I realize that I don't make music, and realized it a long time ago, that I don't make music for everybody, but even the people who it is for, it's not for all the time. And because, like, sometimes you want to watch television, movies, listen to music that requires nothing of you. Sometimes you just need music that'll make you want to dance, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, like nothing. But sometimes you want music that's going to comfort you in a really challenging or dark place or a hard place, or is going to give language to really complicated feelings. Sometimes you don't want to talk about complicated feelings, and that's also okay. You need a respite from that sometimes. So it's like, yeah, like even the people who were into the new record couldn't listen to it a lot, probably, and which I get, and so, I'm perfectly comfortable with that. Like I'm perfectly aware of it. I think the only trouble comes when, when the people listening get preoccupied with what the relationship is, and they feel like they either need to tell me they're not cool with it, or they need to stick around to watch the ship go down, or they need to. I'm like, listen, I'm totally cool with this not being where you are, and this not, and it in no way detracts from how grateful I am that we did spend some time together, and that there were some seasons where we really were pacing and aligned with each other and maybe feeling some of the same things at the same time. Like, I'm still super grateful for that. And like you said earlier, those songs are still there. My writing of the new songs doesn't unwrite the old ones. Like, they're still there. I still made them. And if you still resonate with them, you can still listen to them. I might even still play them if you come see the shows and stuff. Like, it's not that. So it's like, and I feel fine, because while I might not be today or relate to the person who wrote some of those old songs, I still trust him that when he was trying to do his job, which is to look at the world and describe it, that's an artist's job description, that knowing what he knew, standing where he stood, he did the best job that he could. And therefore I occasionally cover his material, but he's not me, but I'm already not the person who wrote Fingers Crossed. And so that's why I'm working on a new record now. Like, it's the nature of the job.
Yeah.
It's the risk you run when you're trying to look at the world and describe it for people, that, the week after. So if you do that job and you do it well, a week later, Lord knows, a month, a year, 5, 10, 20 years later, you could stand in the same place and see something completely different. Document it, frame it, focus it a different way. Maybe not even think to document it at all, because it doesn't seem all that significant to you. That's just the nature of the job. So it's like, there is going to be there's going to be turnover, and that's okay. And like, I feel okay about it. I understand it. Sometimes I wish that the folks who find themselves no longer resonating would be able to be okay with it, and not feel like they now need to put all of the energy that was previously devoted to engaging with me or telling me that they liked me, that now they need to stick around and repurpose all that energy to try and change me or change my mind or try to figure it out. Like, they can just, like, I mean, sometimes it mostly all just happens on the internet, which is a flaming trash pile mostly. But what I'll just tell people is, like, listen, and I mean this genuinely, like, go and be happy. Like, just go be happy. Like, if what I'm making or doing doesn't make you happy anymore, just, like, you don't have to feel so hung up on the idea that we used to be in this great relationship or something, and now we're not. Like, I'm okay with it. And maybe you'll be back, and maybe it'll be because I've changed, maybe it'll be because you've changed, maybe we'll just find our way back into alignment at some point for a season. But, like, you can be free of it, and I just want you to be happy. And if you need to take some swings or throw some punches for a minute because maybe something about the ways that we're no longer aligning are stirring or triggering some feelings in you, or some insecurities or fears, and that's making you angry and feeling vulnerable, and you need to take a few swings, that's okay. I don't mind that being part of my job too. We don't know each other, so usually when people are doing things like that, so I know it's not about me. I usually feel like I'm on the other side of a two-way mirror, and they're looking at me, but they're seeing themselves, and so there's some projection that goes on, and I understand all that. So it's like, and I'm comfortable with it. I just wish that people didn't spend so much time unhappy and being unhappy, vocally unhappy with me sometimes. I just think that's a waste of everybody's time, and it's okay if that's what they need to do to get through the season, but I just don't want people to feel like that they have to. It's like I mean, just the classic anecdote of it is somebody, spending weeks and weeks tweeting at me that that they can't follow me, and that they're not gonna follow me anymore. And I'm like, cool. Like, you don't you don't need to keep telling me. You could just not follow me anymore. Like, you can just absolutely unfollow me if we're not in alignment or whatever anymore. But instead, they just want to spend the rest of our relationship apparently together telling me how we're not and how they can't follow me anymore. I'm like, you know what? Like a week ago, you could have just unfollowed me and gone and been happy. It doesn't matter either way to me. So really, it's not affecting me. But so it's like sometimes you feel like you know, it's a bummer because you do understand that it's ultimately out of love. It's like the bands who I'm the most critical of and I get the most disappointed in when they're doing things that I don't like as much as the last thing they did, or I realize that we're not in the same place anymore in our lives for whatever reason. Mostly it could be stylistic, but sometimes it is content. Mostly my frustration or anger or disappointment it comes from a deep love and for them. And the love I have around the way I used to feel about them or the way I still feel about certain things, but like there's a direct proportion between my level of disappointment and frustration with a band and how much I love that band. If I didn't love that band or that music, I wouldn't waste my energy or my time being frustrated with them because they don't matter that much to me. So I do know that the people who get especially bent out of shape about it and really go out of their way to tell me about it, I do understand that it is, I do kind of try to receive it as an expression of care and an expression of love. And I do think that in my experience anyway, that tends to be what it is. And so it's just a matter of kind of having eyes to see it.
Yeah, there's this weird thing going on in any sort of fandom these days where, you know, like I said, I'm a movie guy. If Steven Spielberg or Martin Scorsese make a movie I'm just not feeling, I don't like it, or it just isn't my thing, I can move on, wait for their next movie, and I'll enjoy it. But there's this entitlement that comes with certain pockets where because we like you and we buy your stuff, we are entitled to kind of talk back to you, control you, and tell you how it should be. You see that with Star Wars right now.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we see that even more in Christian communities where people feel like, hey, because we've come together on this thing that, you know, a lot of us believe is truth, then when you start straying from that, we have the right to pull you back in because that's our job. And I think there is such often a lack of empathy toward that because... Well,
you can't see past your own relationship to it.
Right.
And so I totally, I get it.
I think going back and listening to it, like what I remember thinking is, oh wow, I've had friends who have gone through many of the same circumstances you have, and I never once knew this is what they were feeling.
Huh.
And I never once talked to, I preached at them. I did the I will pray for you and I'll walk away thing. But I never listened to them. And then there's other times where I can think 10 years ago, had Fingers Crossed come out, I would have, never listened again. But
right.
now I listen to it, and there are lines in there where I'm like, oh, I've thought that. I've asked that question before, and I can relate to this different than I could 10 years ago. And how am I going to relate to it tomorrow? And it's this weird relationship with the music that I think just demands a lot of us that people aren't always willing to give.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I know that I've done that with records and with movies and with just friends in general. So I know that I've done it. So the only thing, so then what you hope for, because it's what I know in my experience has been in the same way with records and stuff, is that you don't worry about it because you know that if there is a point at which someone needs this and someone needs to hear it and then they'll come back and they'll find it. And this just might not be, so much about relationships, it's not always are we a match. Sometimes it's also, but is this our moment? Like, is this the timing? And sometimes you can be a match with somebody, but the timing is off. And, for relationships that are meaningful, all those things have to happen at once. And so, I remember the first time I ever heard Yankee Hotel Foxtrot by Wilco, which is one of my all-time all time favorite records. And I'd been a big Wilco fan before, and when I heard it, I had friends who were raving about it. It's a hard pivot for them in a lot of ways, and it's a hyper experimental record. And so the first time I listened to it, it was just puzzling to me, and I didn't like it. I didn't like how it made me feel. I didn't get it, and I just had to put it on the shelf. And it wasn't because it was not going to be one of the most significant records in my life, not only as it pertains to just how I listen to music and what I like and my own differences and changes in taste and preference, but the way that I make records, the way that it changed everything creatively, up and down, every end of that equation. It changed everything for me, that record. And it was 100% the record that was going to do that in that moment. I just wasn't ready for it. So it's not that we were not for each other. It's not that me and that record were not a match. We were. It just wasn't the time yet. And so sometimes, because I've had this happen too, where this has already happened with Fingers Crossed, where people will tell me that, when it first came out, or maybe they caught a show last year when I was playing some of the new songs before the record came out, and they weren't ready for it, and they absolutely bristled. But literally in the almost year since the record has been out, I guess it hasn't been a year, but it's been a little more than a half a year, and that they've actually either because they've spent time with it, or just a natural slow evolution, or maybe some trauma in their life, or something's happened though that has actually brought us to a piece of real estate together where we can spend some time and where they do relate to it, and so it can happen fast, and sometimes I've probably talked to people in the last month who heard Mockingbird for the first time a few weeks ago and only just first really hit them. And so it's like, you kind of know that's what you're doing. Like, I am putting out kind of permanent records of feelings and emotions and seasons of life, and people are going to find those things at all different seasons of theirs. And I do that with music and movies and stuff. And so, you just, so there's going to be that segment of the audience who don't hear it till much later, and you hope that maybe it's meaningful for them and they're waiting for them when they need it later. And I'm willing to accept that too,
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I've honestly, when you brought up Mockingbird, I feel like since 2016, I've gone back to Mockingbird and Ringing Bell so much more than I probably did in the years between. I feel like those come back for this time, just because we're in crazy times. But,
right.
But one thing I also want to talk about is you're doing Fingers Crossed in your house shows. You're touring with Fingers Crossed right now. And I had never even heard of house shows before until you put out the house show record. Like, I wasn't aware that was a thing, and I had always wanted to go to one, so obviously I went to the one in Ypsilanti a few weeks ago, and I had no idea what to expect, and it's weird. I'm walking into a stranger's house. I was there alone, and you're sitting with, 20 or 30 strangers for a very intimate concert experience. It's probably the most intimate experience you can have at a concert.
Yeah.
And with this album, this is a heavy album. Was there ever a moment where you were kind of, I don't know if I want to tour it this way? This is like cutting myself on the stage each day.
Right. I actually felt like it was precisely and maybe the only way I could tour it, because the content is so, like, of all the records I've put out over the last, the first Caedmon's record, which was my old band, came out, like, we started that band in 92, for God's sake. So, like, I've been doing this for a minute. And of all the songs I've written, all the collections of songs and albums that I've ever put out, Fingers Crossed is easily the most emotionally immediate one. It's easily the most vulnerable one, and the most intimate one to me. It's the first one to me of all my records that you could listen to it and literally know some things about me. And, like, you could know me better. Like, my friends listened to it and knew me better than before they'd heard it, and we're friends already. And a lot of things that are there that maybe even I didn't mean to reveal, but the emotion was so visceral at the time that I was just trying to get it out, and I probably even shared more than I typically would have, much more. And so as I was thinking about it, I was like, it felt counterintuitive to try to tour it in like a detached way and try to get on stage in the dark with a loud PA and sing these songs in a big, loud, detached way. It's like, no, man, I think, because I've been playing house shows for since She Must Shall Go Free came out. So that'd be 15 years ago or so. And, so I've been playing house shows for a long time. It's one of my favorite ways to do shows for that very reason, because it is so immediate and intimate. There's no barrier between you and the people. There is no light. There are no lights, no PA, none of that stuff. It's just like literally a room of 30 to 50 people and me and a guitar. And I thought that is, because there was a point at which I was going to tour it a little bigger and do a different kind of presentation. But then I decided, you know what? I think it's too delicate. Like and in the same way that when I first went to record the record, when I was still writing the songs last year, I really wanted to make more of like a electric guitar record this time around. I wanted to make like more of a kind of a rock record. But as the songs were coming out, it didn't make any sense to pick up the electric guitar. I was picking up a little nylon string guitar, which is like the softest, mellowest, darkest, little guitar ever, like a classical nylon string. But I just kept picking it up, and that's just where the songs wanted to live. That's where they wanted to come out. And so I had to change what I had wanted to do what the songs wanted and to follow those coordinates. And I feel like kind of the same thing happened with the touring. I was like, you know what, this is, because like I said before, it doesn't to me really feel like going back any more than when you pull up your pictures on your phone to show somebody the vacation that you had. You're not literally re-vacationing. Mm-hmm. Now you might remember something from the moment you snapped the picture, but it's really just a document of a place you were at one time, and the further away the occasion, the less you really feel about it, and you're just looking at a picture just like anybody else is looking at a picture. You kind of remember being there. You don't necessarily remember what you had for lunch that day. You don't remember if you had a headache or not. You don't remember if you got a sunburn, but you remember being there. And it's like, for me, these are the documents. They're not the actual experiences. And so it's not easy always to sing through the whole record, because it is a really heavy and a really sad record. And what else could it be, considering my source material? And I look at the world, I tell you what I see, and that's the only thing I can do. And so, but I'm detached enough from it at this point to where it's like you're just looking over my shoulder at documents of some things that happened, but they're not happening right now. And in fact, I've actually never been happier, maybe in my whole life, than I am right now. Like I'm in such a great place in my life, and just with things that are happening, and I'm just like, I'm really happy, and I'm way on the other side of so many of the things that were documented on that record, that it's been good. It's felt healthy for me to like kind of treat those songs like a liturgy, and I go and I spend time with them, and it's like I'm still processing through and finding new things, finding new emotions to attach to some of them. But it reminds me every time I sing them, I have that feeling, that clear feeling of how much less I relate to the real emotion that's there, and that being an indicator to me, and a way by which, a metric by which to measure how much healthier and further I am from some of those things than I was even the week before or the month before. And so for me, it's been great, because it's given me like a plumb line or a litmus test by which I can kind of see my growth and the distance between me and some of those things. And that's a good thing. And that's a good thing. So
you've kind of described the album as a tale of two divorces.
Right.
But I think actually the more I listen to it, I think it's three, because there's a divorce, there's your changing relationship with God, mm-hmm. but there's also this thread of loss of community that comes from all this. Mm-hmm. And I think that comes through so much, and I'm wondering if that's what led to Airing of Grief, where, you're not only searching for community or people who can share their stories, but they're probably looking for it too, because in almost every one of those stories, people are saying how they can't express what they're feeling. They might lose their job, they might lose their families because of these questions they have and these doubts they have.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you've seen that at all, that it's this sense of community that, we're all searching for. Maybe that's why some people stick with things longer, or, what we're searching for once we get out of that.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's insightful. I think you're right. I mean, because that season of, because you're right, I've said that Fingers Crossed to me feels like a tale of two divorces, horizontal, vertical, and that's true. But along with the loss of both comes the loss of everything surrounding those things, and so there was a lot of loss of community, and a lot. I mean, I had like a solid 95% friend turnover, like in the last half a decade, but I've also found a tremendous new community of people, and that's a thing I also want to give equal airtime to. But I think Airing of Grief to me felt like, so I don't only want to tell the stories of loss. I also want to tell the stories. In other words, I don't want it to just be deconstruction. I want it to be reconstruction as well. And
right.
And so that, so the thing about Airing of Grief was, I realized once the record had come out, just after it had come out, as I was trying to get some sense of how it was hitting people and what people thought about it, I was noticing and mentioning to some of my people, my friends, that folks' reactions to Fingers Crossed did not seem to be about the record, really, ultimately. People seemed to mostly use it as an opportunity to tell their own stories of grief and loss, divorces, vertical and horizontal. And I was noticing this a lot. And each person, though, was trying to find language on their own from scratch. They framed it in a way that made it seem as though they were completely alone in it, feeling pretty isolated in the processing of it. And so to me, I just realized, okay, well, so here's an opportunity, because, there are clearly a lot of people who have these stories, about transitions in their faith and their spirituality, but also in their adult personal lives. And there's a lot of stories out there, and people who really need a safe space to be able to tell them, and just to be able to know and feel that they're not alone as they experience them. And so as I was talking to some friends about my noticing of all that, the idea came up of like, well, I wonder, could there be a way to provide a place like that, maybe for people to tell some of those stories around kind of this moment where the record is coming out and people are listening to it, and it's triggering and stirring their own feelings like that. And so it just started off as, I didn't know what it was. I certainly did not imagine it was going to be like a podcast or something. It wasn't anything like that, but it was like wanting to just provide, even just make myself available to talk to people about it. And so and it's just too easy with technology, and I'm such a nerd, to experiment and try things. And so I was like, well, and so I decided to use Skype and to use a little scheduling platform called Calendly that I really love, and I was already using in my business life. And I was like, all right, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a handful per week of opportunities for people just to book 10 minutes, and I'll just spend 10 minutes on the phone with them, and we can just talk about it, and just for them to know they're not alone, and just to have a place to talk. And but not knowing what it might turn into, I did decide to ask people that if they were going to do it, to get their permission for me to record them, all the calls, but with the guarantee that I would bleep their name out if I ever did anything with it, that I would make it anonymous for them. But I wanted to, because I was thinking, for every person who would be brave enough to do that, there'll be 20 people who won't feel safe enough or brave enough to call and talk to somebody that they don't know and tell hard parts of their story too. And so for the benefit of the people who wouldn't be willing to do it, it might just be for every one of those people who is, it might be amazing for that one person to not feel alone in our conversation, but then for there to be 20 people who don't feel alone, potentially being able to listen in on it and them realize that that's their story, and they hear some resonance with their own story, and they feel like someone's telling their story, and that might make them feel not alone, and it could just scale in an important way. So that's kind of what I started doing, was just doing these calls, and I would put a pretty decent amount of times up every week and started kind of talking about it, and they were just getting snatched up so fast. And I mean, I was just doing all these calls, and it was really fascinating, and it was mostly incredible for me, just because it made me feel less and less alone in what I was personally going through, and it was just remarkable. And so I immediately realized, okay, there's something cool happening. What can we do with it? And so then I just pulled in a few of my other friends who are folks in my community, people who I'm going through some of these things with, and had been already talking to about it, who had some skills I don't have, and just said, what can we do with it? And so we decided to turn it into a podcast, and to basically a podcast about unedited conversations of D and Reconstruction, and curated by topic. And so I have a pal who produces it with me, 3 friends actually, but this one in particular who he's like an ex-pastor and one of the smartest and kindest, most pastoral guys that I know, and he started listening to the calls, and then deciding, here's 2 or 3 that are all on this topic. Let's group them together. Here's a few that are on this topic. Let's group them together. And then we started releasing it and calling it the airing of grief, because it's not only we're going to air our grief together, but we're also going to air it. Like, we're going to put it on the air, like we're
right.
And it's just turned into a thing. We're in our 2nd season of it now, but it's just turned into its own thing with its own community around it. And it's been really comforting for me and my friends and a lot of other people who have told us they're listening, and just to hear these stories told and to have a safe place to do it, and some remarkable stories, remarkable. And I've learned so much about people who are going through D and Reconstruction, that it's just so much more complicated than you think it's going to be. It's not like believers and non-believers. It's like, no, there's a lot of people who've gone through such hard things that they have every reason to turn their back on the community of practitioners in the church versus the institution of the church versus the God who is supposedly behind the whole thing. Those are all separate things. They're working hard to keep them separate, to process their grief over all 3 or the loss of any one of those things, or just 1 or 2 of them. And yet they're fighting to stay, they're fighting to believe. Other people don't have a particularly good reason, and they just woke up and kind of don't believe it anymore. It just doesn't ring true. And everything in between. So there's all these great nuanced stories, and we're hearing all of them, and it's been remarkable. So it just somehow naturally led into this, and it feels to me like an extension of the art from Fingers Crossed. It feels like performance art that came out of the record itself, but now, of course, it's taken on its own meaning and its own energy, and a lot of the people who we're now talking to for season 2 don't even listen to mine. It's like it's not even about, and has not for a while been about me. It's taken on its own life now. But so it's been fascinating. Yeah,
it's really a compelling listen. And I think there is like a whole generation out there. There's a podcast I listen to right now called Good Christian Fun, and it's kind of going back and looking at Christian culture with like, kind of a quizzical eye, like, really? What is this? But I think beyond that, you have people who are wrestling with, I grew up in this culture. I grew up in, this thing that defined my whole life, which sometimes I was in because I was born into this family. Right. And now I'm wrestling with, what do I think about that? And I think you're right. It's so many different colors. I know I got out of a period of like 2.5 years of just wrestling with questions that were less about, my faith in a God, and more about this whole organizational thing that we've made of it. And, oh my gosh, the people who taught me one thing are now supporting people and policies that are antithetical to this thing they told me to cherish. What do I do with that? And I felt like, even though I wasn't going anywhere, I couldn't voice those questions because I knew the lectures I'd get. I knew the answers I'd get repeated back at me. So I guess my question is, as someone who is, still in a church, what can I do better? What can churches do better for people who are questioning? Instead of just believe, just read. What can we do better? What do you wish you had had?
You know what? I don't know. It's hard for me to say, and I'm kind of at a point now because I'm detached from it now, and I mean it's been, maybe, a half a decade or so since I've been to church or in a church or around that, and since I no longer really identify myself as part of it, I feel weird about instructing those folks, and I also, to be fair, have friends who do find that in their churches, and they tell me that, and I feel like it feels like more the exception than the rule, but there are people, to be fair, who definitely find a safe place to process complicated things and be complicated people within churches. I do think that happens. I know that happens, so I don't really know. I think it's just so hard for Christians to, even in ways that they don't realize they're doing it, it's hard to not love for some reason. Mm-hmm. It's hard for Christians mostly. It's really hard for most people. I mean, even just because you're trying to get something from somebody. I'm not saying this is unique to Christians. I'm just saying I see there being a lot of agenda driving people being loved or pursued by Christians. And in as far as that desired effect can't be accomplished or gets too hard, then the love runs out. And that, I think that it's hard to love with no agenda. It's hard to love for no reason in particular, other than that someone just is worth loving.
Wow.
And which is to say, to love somebody not for the eventual opportunity to be able to evangelize them, and not for the and I'm not saying to never speak about that person with something you deeply care about something you deeply care about. If you're in a relationship with me, you're eventually going to hear about things I love. You're eventually going to hear about, Arcade Fire, or you're going to eventually hear about, the Back to the Future trilogy, or you're eventually going to hear about, whatever. And so, because we talk to each other and our friends and people who care about things that we care about, sometimes our friends don't care about those things. What I'm not going to do is tell a friend that if they're not interested in hearing about Arcade Fire or the Back to the Future trilogy, and they don't want to talk about that anymore, and they don't like it, and then we're not going to be friends anymore.
Well, to be fair, I would not be friends with someone who did not like the Back to the Future trilogy. Well,
and actually that might be the one
that's a deal breaker.
To be fair, you're probably right about that. But other than that, but it's like, so I think that's the hard work. The hard work is to, and it's internal work. It's personal internal work of like getting to a place where you detach your care for people from the agenda that you believe is ultimately good for them because maybe it gets them saved or something, but to be okay with the idea that some people don't feel as though they need saving. Mm-hmm. And it's actually not your job to persuade them that they do. And if you, depending on your tradition and your type of what any one person considers, I doubt there are a lot of people who are unorthodox in their Christian beliefs. I doubt any of them believes themselves to be so. Everybody thinks that they're orthodox in some way, who would admit to being fundamentally unorthodox in a negative way. So depending on your definition of orthodoxy, I think that a lot of people, like, it might be good for people to remember that it's actually not only not your job, but not in any way remotely in your power to convince someone of their need to be saved, or to persuade anyone's heart of stone out and to replace with a heart of flesh, which is, according to the Bible anyway, the work of the Spirit from beginning to end. Like, you can't save people. You can't. And what would your life and the way that you engage with and love people look like if you got free of the responsibility of saving people, and you could be free to just love people, and then and for that to be the potentially fertile ground for the saving, which is a thing that you can really play no role in, because it's a spiritual act, literally, if it's anything, if it's real, is a thing that could happen in the mysterious fertile ground created by the support and loving relationship that you could have with somebody, but you will play no part in it other than your being there, ready to laugh and cry with somebody, but you don't need to be concerned about it. You are not the Holy Spirit. And Christians make other people frustrated in as far as they believe apparently that they are and behave as though they are, and get preoccupied with the things that they imagine the Spirit must be preoccupied with, like how much longer is this going to take, and how can I steer the conversation around to a moment where I can, how long do I have to walk with this person at the mall before I get to hand them the track?
When can I finish the elevator pitch? Yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't really know what that would mean for my Christian friends, but I think that would be a helpful place to start, and just kind of pull that thread and see what it unravels and see what's underneath.
I think that's great. I have one final question, because I know we're pushed for time, but I know you talked at the show that you are finalizing your next album, and you said you'd hopefully sometime in the next year or so.
Oh, yeah.
And what intrigued me the most is you described it as a punk album.
Yes.
And I am curious as to what a Derek Webb punk album sounds like.
Well, I mean, I've really never made two records the same. I mean, if you go back through, Stockholm Syndrome sounds nothing like Mockingbird, which sounds nothing like The Ringing Bell, which sounds nothing like She Must and Shall Go Free, which sounds nothing like Control, and which sounds nothing like I Was Wrong, which sounds nothing like Fingers Crossed. So it's like they don't, they're all really fundamentally different from each other in terms of style and sound and production. They really are. And there are moments on records like The Ringing Bell that are more of a rock and roll situation, maybe. But this record, the energy, so far to me, it feels as though it is potentially shaping up to be really the yin-yang from Fingers Crossed. It is really in every way the opposite of Fingers Crossed, which is why it needs to be a punk rock record. It needs to be a loud and fast record. It's like that's what the songs are, because that's what the energy is. I mean, Fingers Crossed was like emotionally desperate and melancholy and slow and soft and quiet and careful. And the new record's called Targets, and Targets is, and necessarily must be, the energy is so different. It's where Fingers Crossed was about a lot of loss of faith and certainty, loss of love and relationship. This Targets record is about the finding of new community and a new kind of life and stability, and the finding of love again, and things like that. So it's like the energy is so different, and it's so it needed to be like, because for me, like as a songwriter and as a producer, you want to use every part of the buffalo. So it's like, before you even hear the first lyric, I want you to already have a sense, just from the energy created from the sound, of where we're going and what this is all about. And most of my records I've always worked at least to try to do this, but I've really gotten focused on it in the last handful of years. And so when you hear the very beginnings, the very first sounds of Fingers Crossed, you get a sense of where we're going, and you get a sense of what the tone of it is, and it's reinforced all the way through. Even in my use of weird static and weird distortion sounds and very dissonant chords, it's all designed to make you feel uneasy, and for it to make you feel, like, because the content of what's coming is unsettling, and so you should feel unsettled before you even hear the lyric, because that's the way that it'll emotionally really take root. And so when you hear the very beginnings of Targets, you're going to have a sense that we're in a different season now. We're in a different stage of life now. It's such a different energy, and I want to make sure that I do my very best to communicate that well before you hear the lyric and things like that. So that's and I'd hope to even have it out before the end of 2018, before the end of the year, and that's still a possibility. But life is happening in real time, and so I still have things that I'm documenting that I feel like I want to give time to be able to squeeze as much of them onto this record as possible. And but at very most, it'll be beginning of next year, 2019. But I'm hoping maybe to even have it out before the end of the year. So we'll see. But I'm working on it as we speak. Yeah.
Great. It'll be great when you destroy someone's house during a house show with it.
Well, and that's the thing is just like we talked about with the touring for Fingers Crossed, feeling like it could be nowhere other than that delicate situation in someone's living room. I mean, Targets is going to be different, and I'm going to have to be in some rooms where I can make some noise. And so we'll see how that works.
The Derek Webb Club Tour. I'm down for that.
Yeah. I mean, that's most of what I've done in my career. So I'd love to get back in there. So.
All right. Well, Derek, again, thank you so much. This was literally a bucket list experience for me.
Man.
So if I get hit by a bus when I leave, I'll be that much more satisfied. So thank you again. I would love to have you on again once the album comes out.
Sure.
And talk to you more. And hopefully one day I can talk to you in person over some drinks.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a pleasure, man. Thank you again for asking.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you.